Hey, guys. Welcome to Building This Community.
This is your city business and policy development podcast. We're your hosts,
Luke Patrick
and Andrew Klump. Welcome to this week's episode of Building This Community. Our guest today is Albrecht Stahmer, who is a current entrepreneur in Singapore, as well as a former Louisvillian and former contributor to Insider Louisville. With that said, Albie, thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us here today. As much as I hate to do it, we really need to jump right into these questions. So, Albie, we know you're the founder of Red Bike HRD. Could you tell us a little bit about what that company does? And also give us a quick background about yourself and your career path.
I'm a bit of an entrepreneur. I've done a few different things and am currently doing a few different things here in Singapore, but my main gig is Red Bike HRD, which is a boutique human resources development consultancy based here in Singapore with a focus on leadership development programs for multinational clients. Though I did open a satellite office in Louisville last year, which I hope to better leverage in the future. Our mission at Red Bike is to customize leadership development within organizations to ensure that it aligns with each client's unique mission, vision, values, and strategy, as opposed to just taking stuff off the shelf from executive MBA programs and hoping one size fits all. So I found that there was a demand for that, and I'm hoping Red Bike can fill the niche. We started in 2018. And things were going well, of course, until this whole coronavirus crisis has shut down all international travel for the most part. So that really impedes what I do. And I'm also involved in a restaurant here, Limehouse Caribbean, which is a Caribbean restaurant, what we claim to be the only authentic one here in Singapore. Also part of a sustainable wine brand here, Javelina Wine. 3 friends and I started that in 2017. And then you'd mentioned Insider Louisville earlier. Actually, I'm an investor in Terry Boyd's new startup in Eindhoven, Holland, Dispatches Europe. And I do a bit of writing and contribute to content to his new site as well. But none of this actually has anything to do with my background, which is actually in telecom. That major did prove to be very useful, as the dot-com boom was starting just as I left UK. In 1994.
University of Kentucky, right.
Yeah, University of Kentucky, that's right. So, I guess for a little additional background, I moved to Louisville when I was 6 years old. I went to Holy Trinity in Ballard and then on to UK. And like I said, when I left UK in 1994, the dot-com bubble was just getting started. And I wound up working for AT&T Wireless in the growth markets division down in Miami. And let's see, to make a long story short, after 3 mergers, 1 demerger, an IPO, I had just gotten tired of the chaos at AT&T, and I jumped over to optical fiber, and I wound up working for XO Communications out of Silicon Valley. And through this period of my telecom career, I had also spent a year working in Hong Kong. So once the dot-com bubble burst, I decided that all these telecom companies were idiots and I was much smarter than they were. So I set out to start my own telecom company, arbitraging dark fiber. But there were not a lot of people interested in funding a telco startup in the US in 2001. So I leveraged the contacts I had made in Hong Kong and wound up raising money in Tokyo. And I ended up there for 12 years. But all I wound up proving was that I was no smarter than the companies I'd worked for before, because my startup went bankrupt too. And then from there, through coincidence, I ended up in human resources development in 2007.
That's my story. That is a fascinating career trajectory. And so I think that kind of speaks to anybody that is an entrepreneur of any sort, right? That you don't really know what opportunity is going to lead to next, right? So
spot on.
Telecommunication to HR development does not seem like the typical made-for-TV model of career building, right?
No, you're right. And it's so funny. Like I said, I wound up falling into this by coincidence. And my whole shtick is, basically a company asked me if I could come give a talk on disruption because they knew I had a background in telecom. I went through the dot-com bubble, and the dot-com bubble was particularly difficult on what we call the incumbent exchange carriers, the Baby Bells, AT&T, these huge Goliath organizations that were not very nimble and could not change very quickly. So I went in there and I didn't really know what to talk about because I'm just a public school kid from Louisville, Kentucky, right? It's not like I have this elite background in academia, but I was really lucky to have worked for some branded companies. And even before AT&T, actually, I had been a temp worker at GE out at Appliance Park in Louisville a few summers. And I, of course, put that on my resume. And then most people are blind to actually reading the details. And they just saw GE, AT&T, Silicon Valley. So that gave me something of a reputation as someone who knew something.
So you sold yourself like a normal entrepreneur does, right? I mean,
absolutely. Like some people polish the apple. I injected growth hormones into mine. And I basically went in with this shtick and I said, look, guys, I'm an expert in global leadership and management, particularly bad leadership and management, because I've worked for 5 companies that have declared bankruptcy. So I'm going to do this backwards. I'm going to tell you what I see within your organization that I think will lead to your ultimate demise if you don't change this stuff proactively. And for some reason, that message really resonated amongst middle management because they felt that, oh, this is someone who understands our pain. He's been there. He's done that. And then from there, I got hired by a consulting company based out of Singapore. And then after about 12 years, I was like, well, I'm going to try to do this again by myself. So that's when I started Red Bike HRD 2 years ago.
Well, and so at what point did you start working for Insider Louisville and kind of giving that international perspective? Because clearly, I think your story here paints a picture of the fact that you have a unique perspective that most people don't have, especially in the Louisville market space. So when did you start working for Insider Louisville, and how did you view Louisville from kind of the international perspective?
Yeah, I might have the dates wrong here, but I think Terry Boyd started Insider in maybe 2010, 2011. And I think within 6 or 9 months, he had caught wind of a couple things I had posted on a blog site in Louisville. If you guys know Nick Evans, he used to run straightpinky.com, a Louisville sports blog. And this was about the time all the news was coming out of Sacramento that the Kings, the Sacramento Kings might be looking for a new home. And then 5 college kids in Louisville started this page, Bring the Sacramento Kings to Louisville. I was commenting on there. Through that, I met Nick Evans. And then he said, hey, why don't you come write stuff for my site? And the first thing I did, I believe, was I took apart the lease at the KFC Yum Center. And I basically just annotated the lease and expressed my feelings on why this lease was going to be the financial doom of Metro Louisville at some point in the future unless it were renegotiated. And I think Terry read that blog post, and I just got a random email from Terry that said, hey, do you want to write for Insider Louisville? We pay. That was literally his. I replied back and said, hey, I'm just a dude with a lot of opinions. I'm not actually a journalist, and I happen to live in Singapore. And he said, perfect. And then we just collaborated on a concept. And I'm a bit of a Louisville junkie. I moved there when I was 6, left when I went to go to UK. Didn't come back to work after college, unfortunately. I looked for a job there, couldn't find one. So I went down to Miami. But I love it. It's in my blood, my hometown. Of all the places I live, I claim it as my hometown.
With that international perspective of being in Singapore, having worked in Tokyo, having, tried to get multiple businesses off the ground yourself, like what did that add to your commentary for Insider Louisville? Like what kind of commentary did you have about, the Louisville startup scene? Yeah,
that's a good question. And that's actually exactly what Terry wanted. So, a couple things. For example, there's one column, I'm sure it's up still somewhere, that I wrote comparing the startup scenes in Seoul, Korea, and Louisville, Kentucky. And, of course, Seoul is one of the 10 or 12 richest metropolises in the world. So it's not a perfect comparison. But the point was that the South Korean government was really making an effort to create a startup scene there, and they weren't doing it with pep rallies and cute talking points. They were actually investing hundreds of millions of dollars in the infrastructure necessary to get startups off the ground. And this is something that I've long talked about, both in my previous columns and then just over bourbon with Andrew, is that I really do believe the role of a good municipal government is to make that region as attractive and accessible to businesses, both startups and relocations, as possible. I don't necessarily subsidize a business per se, but you need to be able to subsidize the environment to where businesses do want to relocate there. And that might mean some grants, or that might be tax rebates to other people, or it could have different meanings, different interpretations, but somehow government needs to work hand in hand with the startup scene to entice people to take risks, to entice people to come to your community, to entice people to invest their money. And I don't know if that's something we have in Louisville right now.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think that's definitely what Andrew and I see is the role of government in that situation. But aside from the government's role, do you have any tips for the startups, for the individuals that are trying to get the businesses off the ground?
For me, it's interesting because I'm invested right now. I'm kind of involved with 4 startups, and they're across the board a bit. Like I said, an HR consultancy, so a professional services company, and a restaurant, a wine brand, a sustainable wine brand. Those are the 3 that I'm involved with here in Singapore. And I think for me, it's always a situation where I've fallen into a niche where I see that the market hasn't filled that. So I don't know if I'm a traditional entrepreneur in the terms of someone who has an idea and they force their way into the market, right? When we think of people, or we think of the great entrepreneurial stories of America that they talk about around the world, like Apple or Microsoft or Facebook or Google, Yahoo. These companies really forced an idea they had into the market and created a very disruptive force, not only in that particular industry, but rippled throughout other industries. Whereas I've taken a much more reactionary approach. So, for example, what I saw when I started Red Bike HRD, one Fortune 500 client would hire me to facilitate a program, and we would go through a 5 or 6 day intensive executive MBA program. And then me as the program facilitator, I would then try to figure out how to help these trainees, these future leaders of the organization, go and implement that into their organizations. But when I looked at it holistically, what I saw is basically every Fortune 500 company was doing the exact same thing in their leadership development programs. And I had this feeling that, all you're doing is preparing your employees to jump ship at the next best offer from your competition. Mm-hmm. It didn't seem like anything was exactly aligned to what that company was trying to do. So I pitched this crazy idea to a Fortune 500 company. I said, why don't we use your leadership program as a think tank, and we solve an actual problem. And then we make it a competitive situation where, say, we take 20 future leaders, we break them into 5 teams of 4, we give them a problem, they have to solve it, and then they all present that, they pitch it to the executive board. And it seemed to me that would be a way to make it more realistic and practical in terms of application of anything that came out of this program. So for me, again, that was looking at what was missing in the marketplace and trying to find a niche that I thought could sell. So it
sounds like to me that you're not necessarily, you're kind of pushing, to compress what you're saying, is you're kind of pushing back against the idea of, I guess, the contemporary idea that everybody needs to be a disruptor. And you're saying more look to the niche in the market and find exactly where you fit.
that's what I think is one way to do it. I'm not, I wish I were smart enough to be an industry disruptor. I'm not, but that's the same thing we did with our restaurant. We're here in Singapore. We're like, wow, everybody's got whiskey bars. Does anybody have a premium rum bar in Singapore? Mm-hmm. And as somebody, I actually spent 4 years as a child in Puerto Rico, and then I lived 12 years in Miami as a young adult. So I was like, listen, what if we combined a high-end rum bar with a Caribbean restaurant, authentic Caribbean food? And to me, that was filling a niche again. And it was a thing with our wine brand, right? We're like, wow, everybody's talking about the carbon footprint of wine. The wine industry has an enormously destructive carbon footprint because glass is literally one of the most destructive materials on earth, right, to both make and recycle. Mm-hmm. So we decided, what could we do? And we ended up getting these aluminum lined plastic pouches, which reduces the CO2 footprint of shipping wine across the world by between 80 and 88%. And we thought this would speak to millennials who are less married to brands than they are to the ethos of a company. So we decided, why don't we try to start this wine brand that speaks to millennials who are worried about the environment, not as much worried about whether or not they're having an 80-year-old French bottle of wine.
Well, and I'm filling that gap in the market, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm always looking for. So I think my entrepreneurial eyeballs are a little bit different than the traditional idea of being a disruptor. So,
but that's something you probably have to have a mix of both in any startup scene, right? But as far as Singapore, getting back to Singapore a little bit now, if we're looking at, you've mentioned to me in the past numerous times about their sovereign wealth fund and kind of how it's intertwined with their business development and other non-business policies. Can you kind of explain what that is and what are some of the non-business policies maybe that you've seen in Singapore that could be beneficial?
So actually Singapore has two sovereign wealth funds. And I think combined, I think you can look this up if you want to fact check it, but I'm guessing that somewhere with about $700 billion in assets under management. And the first one I think was established in 1974, and then they established a second one in 1981, and it was mostly to manage the country's foreign currency holdings. So now, given that Singapore is a sovereign city-state, it would be difficult and unfair to compare it to Louisville. Louisville being a municipality that doesn't have the same resources or options that Singapore has for generating and managing sovereign wealth. But when you have this much under management, $700 billion, just the residual income off of that alone is enough to do a lot of things. Mm-hmm. So one thing they've been able to do is create an extremely business-friendly environment. There's a 17% flat corporate tax rate. That's extremely competitive. And for startups, it's even friendlier. For example, for Red Bike HRD, I paid 0% corporate income tax for the first 2 years I was in business. Same with Javelina Wine. So from a startup perspective, they make it really easy to get up and running. They encourage all the big local banks to offer special entrepreneurial accounts to make it easier for startups to do their banking and hold fees to a minimum until they can actually generate cash flow. The government provides numerous subsidy schemes and grants to help startups grow and scale. I actually took advantage of what they call an International Explorer Grant. So basically, they agreed to co-fund an international roadshow for Red Bike HRD. And I went to Tokyo, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City, and promoted my company at international trade fairs. It cost me about $12,000, but they ended up refunding me $10,000 of that once I had proved that I had gotten contracts from this overseas roadshow.
So they're basically paying you $10,000 or giving you $10,000 to go throw parties and try and recruit investors. Is that essentially what you're saying here?
Well, it had to be outside of Singapore. So again, here's a situation where they're not going to subsidize me for generating new business in Singapore. But what they really want to do is make Singapore a global hub of entrepreneurialism. So someone like me, who I never know where my clients might come from. So I've got clients in Chicago, Tokyo, Ho Chi Minh, San Francisco, Los Angeles, London, Amsterdam. But the one thing they all have in common is that they have Asia operations. So from the Singaporean perspective, they love what I do because I'm bringing spending from those aforementioned cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, Amsterdam, London. I'm bringing that spending and I'm circulating it into the Singaporean economy. So they're very, very eager to find companies to work with, startups, who can take advantage of this International Explorer grant. So yeah, exactly what you said. They basically paid me $10,000 to go have parties, attend trade shows, and hopefully sign contracts. And I was able to do that.
As long as it wasn't in Singapore.
Exactly, as long as it wasn't a Singaporean client. So for a startup where cash flow is critical, your programs like these really help.
Oh, yeah.
There's no way I would have been profitable by my second year had I not landed those clients from that roadshow. And I'm not sure I could have afforded such a dramatic roadshow if I were funding everything out of pocket, because I would have worried, all right, what if I don't get anything? How much is this going to impede my cash flow for the next 3 months? So for me, that was just an absolute godsend.
Well, with that experience, and I guess everything else you've learned, like through your years of doing business in Singapore and internationally, what are there any areas that you could then apply from your understanding that might benefit Louisville, or any weaknesses we have as a city that isn't driving investment, anything that we've maybe just not focused on?
Well, I think I'll probably sound like a broken record here, but I think the entire Louisville ecosystem for startups will be limited by the lack of access to capital. Louisville's enduring challenge at this point is to figure out how to get better access to angel and capital investment, and figure out how to get those purse strings to take bigger risks. We hear this all the time, right? Some of the best Louisville startups, once the second round of funding comes, they'll move to Cincinnati or Boston or Austin or Nashville or even the Silicon Valley. How do we reverse that trend? And then I think from a subsidy standpoint, I really can't imagine how Louisville or Kentucky will be in a financial position to offer any type of aggressive subsidies with the Byzantine tax structure, and then now the budget struggles, which are only going to be exacerbated by the pension disaster. So I think it ultimately comes down to how can we persuade Louisville's angel and capital investment community to take bigger risks? Because when you talk to local entrepreneurs, that's what they complain about.
Well, and isn't that, from what I've seen with Cincinnati, they've done, some of their venture capital funds have paired with Boston so that they are getting investments in both cities. Mm-hmm. And it's a way that they've expanded into a larger market, a larger pool of capital, just by trying to team up with venture capital funds in Boston and making it kind of a dual fund. Do you think that's something that Louisville could do maybe with a Nashville or Chicago? Is that what we should be aiming at?
Absolutely. Especially with this coronavirus crisis, what we're going to find is, the shrinking world is going to become even smaller in terms of people telecommuting, and location is going to be less and less important to where you are, because there was always a positive aspect to economic clustering, right? There's a reason why startups go to places like New York, Boston, and Silicon Valley, right? There's money there. There are lawyers there. There are accountants there that all have experience and knowledge that can help the startup scene. But as we dissipate more and more, especially with the coronavirus impacting how office work will look in the future, I think that's a great idea. I've always had this crazy idea. In fact, I was working on a column for Insider Louisville when they were acquired, and then new ownership didn't keep me on board as a columnist. But I always had this crazy idea that Louisville could start its own type of sovereign wealth fund, which is not entirely foreign in the United States. Texas and California both manage their public employee and teacher pension funds in this way. But Metro Louisville should really consider selling the Louisville Water Company. They're the sole shareholder, and then use that money to start its own wealth fund of sorts, with a certain percentage of that being reinvested into local startups, or maybe even partnering then that money with startup money from Silicon Valley, Chicago, Nashville, Boston, New York, wherever. Of course, there's a risk associated with the strategy, and there's always, I know, the additional peace of mind of having a civically owned local utility in terms of price stability and corporate decision making. But on balance, has Louisville really maximized its investment in and ownership of the Louisville Water Company over the years? I mean, could that money be used to leverage something bigger and better, like maybe some type of sovereign wealth fund? Yeah, I certainly appreciate that the city has cheap water, but probably at under market rates right now. And the city's also incredibly water rich with the Ohio River and limestone aquifer. So I'm not sure prices would increase dramatically with a corporate owner.
Well, and I think that's an interesting comparison to the parking garage situation that we have, right, with Park in Louisville, and that there was talks about trying to sell that to just pay off, our budget for the last fiscal year when there was the pension crisis going on in Kentucky. But what you're saying,
still going on.
It's still
Kentucky,
going on.
Yes. Still going on.
But you're saying more of being proactive with something here, and I think that to me, and I'm still not sold wholeheartedly on that concept, to be quite honest. But I think if you're going to do it, it makes a lot more sense to be proactive with it and go and have a goal in mind rather than just selling it, like potentially selling Park and selling parking garages, which is a source of revenue, albeit small, but just to shore up some sort of debt that we have, versus taking a policy so that we can have a better startup scene or something in the future. That to me makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, from a financial perspective, I really detest the idea of selling an asset to plug recurring spending issue or a recurring spending hole in the budget. That's really dangerous because that's a one-off. If you're going to sell an asset like Park or the Louisville Water Company, make sure you're doing something with that money that has the potential to return many times over. And like I said, I certainly realize that this idea has enormous risks to it, but we always talk about Louisville needing to be bold. Well, this would be bold. And not only could it attract potentially startups from around the region to relocate to Louisville, but as you said earlier, this might be Louisville's opportunity to be able to partner with capital in Cincinnati or Boston, Austin, New York, Silicon Valley, wherever. And instead of those places poaching our startups, maybe we could help some of these startups stay here and grow, or even poach startups from other places. What was the last major company that a national company that Louisville grew from its infancy?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's probably, is it Humana? I mean.
Well, I guess you could say Humana, maybe Kindred, but Kindred was a carve out out of Humana. Louisville as a community, we haven't been that enormously successful in creating homegrown national companies in the 21st century, let's say.
So you're talking about showing up our weaknesses and being bold here. And I know, and you hinted at it a little bit earlier, I know you're very passionate about bringing the NBA to Louisville. And you have been for a long time. So can you give me kind of what you think it would do for the city, both locally and internationally? And then after you're done with that, I want you to give me the best pitch that you have, as if you're sitting down at a table drinking bourbon with Adam Silver and a billionaire owner.
Yeah, well, I think for the city, region, and state, it's simply the best way that Louisville could position itself and brand itself as a global city. I mean, what other way will Louisville be on televisions, websites, and in newspapers around the world a minimum of 82 times per year? This is what I don't understand, where people wouldn't even consider it. There's so many naysayers and opponents of the whole idea, but why wouldn't you consider it just from a business perspective? But I like to use this anecdote, and I shared it years ago with Nick Evans when he was hosting the Sunday Morning Hangover on ESPN 680. I think it was like 1998 or something. I was managing a project in Guangzhou, China. And I had spent a Saturday afternoon hiking up to see this Buddhist temple up in the mountains. And I was taking a break on a little bench, and about a half a dozen Chinese school kids, I don't know, maybe between 10 and 13 years old or something, they came up to me because they wanted to practice their English. Remember, this was just 5 years after Deng Xiaoping's Great Southern Tour of 1992 that opened up the economy. And I was in Guangzhou, a city of 11 million people, and there were only 3 hotels that accepted foreign passport holders. So it wasn't every day that they would see a guilo, with their affectionate term for foreigners, which actually means white devil. But they came up to me and they started chatting. Yeah, they could do very rudimentary greetings in English, and which was probably better than my Mandarin at the time. And I was trying to explain that I was from Louisville, Kentucky, and nobody was getting it. And then one kid started talking about Michael Jordan, and it was hilarious. With sticks in the dirt on the ground, we were able to kind of triangulate Louisville's geographic location by using the Chicago Bulls, Indiana Pacers, and Atlanta Hawks, because those kids all knew who Michael Jordan, Reggie Miller, and Dikembe Mutombo were. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing. And I thought that was so cool. And then a similar thing happened like a year later. I met this Chinese guy, couldn't speak a word of English, but he knew who Peyton Manning and the Indianapolis Colts were. Mm-hmm. And I just found that was like really, for me, eye-opening with regards to how professional sports can brand a city. Because I don't think any of these kids would have ever heard of Atlanta, Indianapolis, or any other of the flyover cities. Had it not been for their professional basketball and professional football franchises.
Well, and that's why, and that's exactly that you have to have. It gives you that global presence, right? There aren't a lot of different alternatives to get that type of notoriety on an international stage.
Right, and sure, the Kentucky Derby is absolutely a global event, but it's once a year. Mm-hmm. And the average kid on a mountainside outside the city of Guangzhou, China, has not heard of the Kentucky Derby, but he has heard of the NBA, because again, it's 6 months of the year or more, 8 months of the year if you include the playoffs, right? Where it's every day in the newspapers. So I do think there's an enormous advantage to that, and I think it would be a great way for Louisville to go from somewhat of an unknown city to at least a city that appears in sports sections around the
world. All right. Well, then give me your pitch. Give me your pitch. Why should the NBA and a billionaire want to move a team to Louisville?
Yeah. Well, I think first we have to acknowledge, yes, it would be a small market, but it would be the single most devoted fan base in professional basketball. Maybe even all of professional sports. There's a latent fan base here that yearns to be a professional sports city, and I don't think those fans will ever abandon their local team if we got an NBA team. And we can further look at this idea of how the NBA thrives in one-horse cities. Cities like San Antonio and Oklahoma City. These have been fantastic NBA cities, but they don't have a fraction of the basketball fandom that Louisville does, or the entire state of Kentucky. They're great NBA cities, but they don't have the same passion that greater Louisville does. And this franchise would be the biggest fish in our small pond in terms of professional sports. And instead of looking at UK and U of L as competition, look at it holistically in terms of what basketball means to this region. I think that's what we have to sell.
I'm sold.
Yeah, no question, man. I think you did a great job there. Well, I want to change gears just a little bit. I may have picked that once or twice in the past. Well, no, I want to talk about something else that Kentucky's known for, and that's our bourbon. And bourbonism has been for a long time a major topic in business development in Kentucky. It's really been like one of the pillars of Kentucky's economy. That we love our bourbon here. We love to export it, and we've heard a lot of talk about a growing appetite for it in China, Japan. I was wondering if you've seen anything like that in Singapore, and also alternatively, do you think Kentucky is maybe like a little too reliant or a little too friendly to the bourbon industry? You hear those criticisms sometimes.
Yeah, great questions. First, absolutely. I mean, it's no longer just bourbon historically has followed U.S. military presence, right? Wherever U.S. stationed troops after World War II, there tended to be a bourbon culture, right? Japan, Germany is big on Jack Daniels, which I know is not technically a bourbon, Tennessee Sour Mash whiskey, but I think finally now we're seeing growth outside of that. China is a great example. Here in Singapore, we're seeing it just the 8 years I've lived in Singapore. It used to be I would go into a bar and it would be the standard Jack Daniels, Jim Beam White, Jim Beam Black. That was it. Now you can get almost any of the small batch bourbons here. Now, granted, it's going to cost you. Keep in mind, a bottle of Jack is anywhere from $100 to $125 in a liquor store here. So it's expensive.
Yeah,
here.
whoa.
But those are the syntaxes, the important syntaxes. But yeah, there's definitely growth. Absolutely. Now, there's always been this old business adage that you should really consider diversifying if any one client produces more than 30% of your revenue. And I suspect Bourbonism produces more than 30% of Louisville and Kentucky's tourism revenue. But yeah, I say milk it while we can. I certainly respect those opinions that say there's a bourbon bubble right now, and that may well be the case. But I also see so much room for growth, and there's still a strong appetite for bourbon globally, especially now that some of the smaller brands and some of the specialty brands are getting sent around the world. In fact, I just ran into a German guy here in Singapore who is trying to get one of his coworkers from New York to bring him a bottle of Wilderness Trail. I don't think 2 years ago anybody outside of Kentucky knew who Wilderness Trail was.
I still don't know who Wilderness Trail is.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely that's a deep track right there. That's not one you hear.
Trail is a great brand. I encourage you guys to try it. What I love about it is it's a scientific bourbon. It's some yeast experts who decided to take all their knowledge of whiskey making and create the perfect scientific bourbon. Because as you know, most of these bourbon brands are filled so much with backstories that may or may not be based on kernels of truth. Whereas they've taken a really scientific approach to it. And what amazed me is that this guy is a Scotch snob, and for him to say, that's one of the best whiskeys I've had, I need to get more of that. I was like, yeah. So there is an enormous room for growth still, because if you think about how big Scotch is globally, not to be to criticize Scotch or anything, because they've done a phenomenal job, that entire industry too. But I think you can turn some Scotch drinkers, especially fringe Scotch drinkers, that means people who've not been drinking Scotch since they were yay high. I think you could turn some of those into bourbon drinkers. So I do think there's still room for growth.
Well, and the Scotch market is at least the rare Scotch market is a lot higher than the rare bourbon market at this point. And I mean, do you think that the bourbon market is going to kind of traject in that direction?
I don't think so. I think, I'm one of those guys that thinks, the whole Pappy Van Winkle thing is just the most ridiculous thing ever, right? I think what bourbon has to its advantage that basically, once it's in a barrel more than 8 years, it's going to be a pretty rough whiskey coming out, right? Being in new charred barrels, right? You can't compare aging processes of bourbon with Scotch. They're two distinctly different whiskeys in that regard. So I think where bourbon's sweet spot is your daily whiskey of choice. I think Scotch will always have that collector's edition where they're going to sell bottles of Scotch for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. I just don't see bourbon going that way. But what I do see people doing is, why can't we replace Scotch and soda with bourbon and water? Or whatever, Dewar's. Why can't Dewar's as a Scotch of choice in bars around the world be replaced by Jim Beam or Maker's Mark or whatever it may be? I think that's probably where you can get some of the new customer growth, is just replacing daily Scotch with daily bourbon.
I hope that's the trend, because I think Scotch tastes like bourbon with a cigarette put out in it. I think Scotch is just disgusting.
Yeah, Scotch doesn't do it for me either. But I think the other important thing is that bourbonism part, and I do think we have to give Greg Fisher's administration credit for really pushing that, because I do know people in Tokyo and Singapore who want to visit Louisville or have visited Louisville just for the bourbon culture, because it's so authentic there, right?
Well, that's great to hear.
Yeah, authenticity is so important. Because you guys remember some of these silly branding campaigns that Louisville has tried, and they never really resonate outside the ad agencies that create them. I mean, what was that whole possibility city thing? Really?
I think that's still it, but
yeah.
I mean, what does that even mean? Or I remember, I think I said earlier, we relocated to Louisville in December 1977. And I remember within a couple years, say 3 years or so, the city landed the AAA Redbirds, who are now the Bats, right? And I think they relocated from Missouri or somewhere. And I remember the city was so excited about that. There was a chest-bumping civic campaign called "Look What We Can Do, Louisville, Look What We Can Do." And they actually made a song and a television commercial out of that. And I was only 6 or 7 years old, so it wasn't so surprising to me. I just didn't really understand it. But my parents, I remember them being so bemused and befuddled by this. They had met in Chicago, then we had been in New York, we'd been overseas for 6 years, and then got transferred to Louisville. And they do like Louisville, don't get me wrong, but they were just so befuddled by this whole concept of celebrating a AAA baseball team coming to town. So getting back to Bourbonism, I think we need to own it and make Louisville literally the global capital, or maybe the region, because we can't count out Bardstown. The region, the capital of bourbon, just like San Francisco has been able to do with Napa Valley and wine. I think someone else, I can't remember, but I think one of the local sports talk guys was talking about how embarrassed he was 3 or 4 years ago when Louisville threw this huge pep rally at the airport because we got a direct flight to Louisville or to Los Angeles. That's where we've got to figure out what is worthy of celebration and what is simply expected.
That's a great way to put it. Aldi, I've really appreciated you taking the time to talk to us today. We're needing to wrap it up, but before we get out of here, we'd like to ask all of our guests this final question. If you had the power to change one policy, one aspect about Louisville, what would it be?
I'm completely aligned with Mayor Fisher on this one. It's the local option sales tax. I think that could be an absolute game changer for Louisville, especially in the current budget environment, which is only likely to get worse because of the additional pension obligations. But the local option sales tax literally lets people vote on projects they do and don't want. Looking at the capital projects landscape now, things like Waterfront Park Phase 4 or the 10-year stalled Portland Wharf Park project would be perfect potential project for a local sales tax referendum. Or more ambitiously, the city could even try to take baby steps towards mass transit, fund trolley lines along Main Street, Market Street, or Broadway, or Bardstown Road. Because when it comes to state funding, Louisville is always at such a disadvantage in Frankfurt with regard to spending allocations. And this would be one way to keep Jefferson County tax dollars in Jefferson County and allocate them towards specific projects.
Well, and that's something that we've seen in a number of other cities, across the country. I mean, I know in particular Oklahoma City really used that in their kind of luring and developing of the Oklahoma City Thunder, right? So, and their arena downtown. So that wouldn't be something that's unique to Louisville, but it's something that's proven success in a number of other cities. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's just one that I see that I don't understand the pushback from Frankfurt on that one. But obviously the Louisville's been trying for years now, so hopefully they'll be able to push it through about the same time they can actually get legalized gambling and maybe build a casino in Louisville and maybe have a sports book. Let's see. And then top it off with a Topgolf.
Oh man, yeah. Don't even get us started on Topgolf.
that just goes back to the whole what type of we brand ourselves as a community that's really pro-business and really welcoming of people coming here, and then when something like Topgolf happens, we have people that boycott it or try and prevent it from happening. So what we try and publish ourselves as, we don't necessarily always back up. So, but Albie, with that said, we certainly appreciate you stopping by and being on our show. For our new listeners, please make sure to stay tuned. We're going to have a 15-minute wrap-up, our kind of gut reaction to this interview. And as always, Albie, appreciate it. And next time you're in Louisville, we're going to get a bourbon again.
Thanks a lot, man.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
We'll pick back up with our reaction segment after a word from our sponsor.
Well, Luke, that was as fascinating an interview as I've done in a long time. Albie is interesting simply because he can speak to so many broad areas. We hit Bourbonism, we hit MBA to Louisville, we hit sovereign wealth funds, we hit the startup community, we hit Singapore comparing to Louisville. What did you think about that, Luke? And is there anything that really stood out to you?
I definitely want to talk about sovereign wealth funds. Super interesting idea, like concept. It's not, I don't think, as relevant in Louisville for a couple reasons. I mean, chief among them, Louisville and Kentucky generally are in just a terrible financial state right now. I mean, a lot of it is due to like annual, like necessary expenditures, like things like spending on pensions. And we currently are experiencing just a terrible pension crisis in the state. Like several of the funds that the state is currently operating are in just a terrible financial.
Well, and so you're saying essentially that in order to kind of go towards that sovereign wealth fund model, we need to have a surplus.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
or something liquid that we can.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's great for Singapore. It's great for a state like Norway, where they have oil revenues to lean on, and they have an enormous budget surplus every year. And, if we ever reach a point where we have a surplus, it's definitely something to think about. I think aspects of, successful models like Norway has run a super successful, like investment model for their fund over the last few decades. And certain things you can take away from that are there's a ton of transparency in the way that they operate their fund. They've implemented, really strict reporting requirements. The public has a great deal of access to any kind of information they would want about the fund. And I think that's really necessary if you want the fund to operate in the public's benefit,
Well, and I think to the model, the white paper that you found and you're kind of hinting at right now that you want to attach on the Norway model, right, is that what they've done is not only have they made it transparent, but they've also showcased over a couple of decades how they would change the priority of investments, change the priority of where the money is then the income from the fund is then going towards. Yeah. So do you want to speak a little more on that?
Yeah. In like getting ready for this week's episode, I read a couple white papers. One was on like the strategy for investment by the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And really like the big takeaway is they've kind of challenged like the orthodoxy in like big fund investment, which normally valued fixed income assets over like equities, things like stocks. And so you see Norway basically said, we're a really long-term investor. We want this fund to operate for, as long as like our country exists, basically. So we've got the longest time horizon you could imagine, and we have a massive pool of resources because they're siphoning money from their, like all the surplus from their oil exports are being pumped into their sovereign wealth fund. So they're incredibly wealthy. I think their assets value like almost like $1 trillion.
Well, and I think the important thing with this, which is a little inverse of what we do mostly here, at least in Kentucky, is that to that point is that not only are their investments a little more diversified, but they're dog-earing their income for investment rather than dog-earing what the revenue that they get from the investment goes towards. So to clear that up, they're not saying this fund is specifically for pensions, right? They're saying our petroleum revenue in Norway is going to fund our sovereign wealth fund. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think that's incredibly important. Whereas in Kentucky, the closest thing we really get to one of these major funds is either the pension funds or maybe the municipal gas tax, which really isn't a fund. And so let's just take the pensions. So those are primarily funded by employees' taxes. So, like the teachers pay into their own fund. And if run right, they can be successful. And then you look at something maybe like the municipal gas tax, where you tax gas in order to then redistribute and repay out that revenue to the different cities and counties throughout the state to repave roads. But that's also like a double dog-eared, kind of like the pension funds that we have here too, is that not only are you minimizing what is put in, but then you're also saying that it can only go towards something when it comes out. And by doing that with say the municipal gas tax, if you reduce the revenue at any point just because gas prices go down or the cost of roads substantially goes up, then that mechanism doesn't work any longer. So ultimately, I think a lot of times those double-ended dog-eared funds are just bad law. But in total, these are the only two things I see that are even remotely close, and really they're not.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any mechanism like it currently. Something you can think of, that was discussed by Albie was that local option sales tax.
Mm-hmm.
You see them often called losts. Basically, it's in addition to the base sales tax.
Mm-hmm.
You see statewide.
So from 6% to 7%.
Yeah, it would go from 6% to 7% effectively here in
Louisville.
In Louisville.
Louisville,
because the base state sales tax is 6%. In Louisville, we would add an extra 1%, would make it 7%.
But we have the Frankfurt, the constitutional preventions for that right now. So we'd have to get a constitutional amendment, or at least some sort of amendment from Frankfurt to allow us.
Yeah. This isn't something we actually have. It's something that's being discussed, and there's some serious impediments to it. Like right now, our Constitution seems to have.
Well, and the other thing that I think is important to what you just said was that when you talk about these local option sales tax, a lot of cities will just immediately still dog-ear that for particular funds, right?
Yeah.
So to me, if you're looking at just short-term gain, okay, then a local option sales tax can be beneficial. Like Oklahoma City, as we mentioned earlier, used it to help get their city ready for an NBA team, right? And use it for their arena and other aspects there. But I think what we're hinting at here, right, is more of let's use a local option sales tax to get into a fund and slowly start accruing interest so that we can start relying on it. I'm looking at from even an Audubon Park perspective, right? In Louisville, there's 83 incorporated cities. I don't know that long term they're all going to last because it's so difficult to find people to manage those budgets. But what each of these small cities could have is a sovereign wealth fund where even if you're just putting $10,000 away a year, just slowly building that up long term, to me, that is the way of the future for America and for all of our cities and states that really are looking at budget issues right now. Is that at some point you got to start looking at using your money to make money. You can't just keep using it to pay bills.
Governments are pretty bad at saving money. Like
American governments.
Yeah, American governments are pretty bad about saving money. And our state in particular has proven just terrible at managing their finances. And a big part of why we've gotten where we are is actually a lack of transparency in some of the investment contracts that our pension funds have found themselves, a party to. And we've implemented some legislation in Frankfurt that has tried to shine a light on some of those, contracts. They often included excessive management fees and things like that.
But those aren't sovereign wealth funds, right?
Well, no, they're pension funds, but you can think about them they're very much the same thing. They're really close. Like a pension fund and a sovereign wealth fund are operating. Well, they're being invested in much the same way, or traditionally they would be. They might serve slightly different purposes. Like a sovereign wealth fund would have kind of a more generalized purpose. Like they serve like the general welfare, maybe of like whatever jurisdiction it like services. But a pension fund is for like a specific portion of the population generally.
Yeah.
But in terms of like their investment strategy, it would operate much the same.
That's something that, even Gil Holland here in Louisville pitched the idea of getting, with our excess last time that we had in our budget, that to put towards an ETI, as he called it, which was an economically targeted investment fund. I think he actually wrote an article in the Courier Journal about it. But it's along that same measures, right? Is then if you have a fund that even if you keep it open generally, kind of like what Norway has done, but still looking at societal needs and ways that you can reinvest that in the community, that's the most important concept behind it. The danger there is that if you're not narrowing these funds and making them assigned to particular causes, so dog-earing it, right? Then you're running the risk of just having it be essentially a slush fund where the council can kind of do whatever they want and so if you're looking at it from an altruistic perspective or like a wealth equity perspective, you're not necessarily going to see the returns in that if you don't define it or retain it into specific areas. But maybe that's just maybe you're just relying on your votes to get that done.
Economic development funds, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, whatever pool of capital you're talking about, like the biggest issues that always arise are policing, like the asset managers, and policing, the reporting requirements, making sure that like the information that needs to be made public is all required by law. So there's no question as to whether or not it's going to be published. And you also want to make sure that like the contracts are transparent. Anything. Oftentimes you'll bring in outside asset managers. It can pose a problem because they'll often require pretty steep fees, but the argument in favor of bringing them in is they'll often give you really insider expertise knowledge of specific investment like opportunities, certain markets that are real niche, like something to do with natural resources or like medical products or something like that. There might be a specific asset manager, a specific investment professional that really has an insider's knowledge that, is worth that extra fee. But I think way too often the case, you're running into charlatans that are just trying to milk the city or the government for, as much as they can to help invest their resources.
So I guess our conclusion here, right, is that we're looking at this at saying that ultimately, I guess you and I would agree that this is the way that we should look for new opportunities, especially when we start to get more of a surplus or more room for investment in Kentucky and Louisville, but that there are a lot of pitfalls when doing this. So if you don't have the transparency, if you don't have strict regulations and a keen eye on those actually investing the money, and then also what you're doing with those funds, how they're tailored, those three areas are things that could easily derail any well-intentioned wealth fund.
Well, you see, at the state and municipal level, like the bigger the fund, generally, like the easier it is for mismanagement to creep in. Like it's harder to perform. Well, it might not necessarily be harder to perform oversight. It is, but I think it's harder to raise the public awareness. It's taken years for the Kentucky pension crisis to come to light.
So that's just something that we need to, if we're taking these steps, we need to start making sure that we're covering up or properly adhering to some guidelines on how to make sure that our managers of our funds are actually being watched.
And I think that is much easier at the city level than it would be at the state. So that's why I think these economic development funds are probably a pretty good idea, as long as they're accompanied with
well, and you see their success in Singapore and country, Singapore's essentially a city state, but the way that they had their business development run through that, I mean, that is something that we could easily try and mirror, and just say that you have to try and get money from investment dollars from other cities or states to be able to get reimbursed or something like that. I mean, that to me is an ideal way of using it, as well as the social justice aspects of it as well. So With that said, do you think are there any other conversation pieces that you think stuck out from Albie? I don't know if it was the NBA Louisville or the Bourbonism or
NBA Louisville's great, but as we know, we've got a really important guest coming up in the next few episodes that we're gonna probably dedicate a whole episode to NBA to Louisville. So I think we can pretty much leave off by saying, there are pros and cons to bringing a pro sports team to Louisville, but Andrew and I are probably both on the same page. That'd be a great thing to happen.
And we don't want to beat a dead horse. So if we're going to talk about this in a few episodes in the future, we don't really want to.
Yeah, we'll talk about it later.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting. It came up super briefly, but the idea of selling the Louisville Water Company to fund some kind of economic development, I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, I'm still not sold on that idea because
I think it's pretty crazy. It's a radical idea, but it's definitely something that I've not heard anybody propose anything like that, and it got me thinking.
As a current city council member of Alderman Park, again, so not the same as Metro Louisville, not even close.
Yeah,
right. But to me, I'm someone that never wants to give up contracts or assets because I think they're just so valuable, and that ultimately when you shrink your pool, that you're just shifting that burden over to the taxpayers.
Yeah.
So if you're adding police contracts for other areas, or you're adding new services that you can charge for, you have an ability to get revenue based on usage, like the water company, that you're not necessarily shifting over directly to the taxpayers. So the moment you take that away, then there could be, we have a sovereign wealth fund, but there's other things that we want to do that we're no longer having that revenue from.
Yeah.
So we need to up our taxes, right?
Oh yeah.
And so I don't want to see city governments just raise taxes simply because they're getting rid of an asset and trying to use that fund for a particular purpose. And I think that to me is the pitfall that you see there. But with that said, I don't know that there's necessarily another type of asset or potential way in the short term of starting a sovereign wealth fund from the Louisville perspective, unless you really start small and add $10,000, $50,000 a year until you can slowly increase it.
It would take a lot of years with the current budget, man. Before COVID even started, the estimated 2019 budget shortfall, $35 million. It was expected to grow to $65 million.
Yeah, but now we're getting the CARES Act, right? And so with the CARES Act, you're getting a lot more funds coming to cities. I mean, Alderman Park, we're getting at least I think around $80,000. We might get up to like 112, simply because our police department worked in the middle of a pandemic. And so we're getting reimbursed by the federal government for that. And I think cities across the country are going to start getting that as well. And so it's just a grant to apply. So I'm not as concerned about that deficit right now until we see what Metro Louisville gets from the federal government in response to COVID. Because honestly, if you look at it, you're saying, oh, well, the federal government's helping us out with COVID, but they're doing it in a strange way because they're giving money to help cover police services in the middle of a pandemic. But Louisville was already going to pay for that. The shortcomings are coming from other social services. The state of Kentucky's having a shortfall because we're paying for unemployment at an unbelievable rate. But the reimbursements we're getting is coming in different areas. I mean, it's coming as a blank or as an open check, so the state and city, whatever, can use it however they want. But I think that's the interesting aspect, is that instead of being reimbursed for the shortfalls that we're having, we're being reimbursed for areas that we already had the funding for. Yeah. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that money gets redistributed out. So I want to pause on that conversation, because I don't know what our shortfall is going to be once this CARES Act money comes in.
I have a really tough time believing that it's going to completely patch the hole in our budget that we had prior to this whole episode.
Yeah, and maybe it won't.
But I'm maybe not so optimistic that our current government has the capability to make the changes they need to fix the budget going forward. So if we get a one-time fix, like a big lump sum of cash,
to patch like the annual budget shortfall one time. What changes are we going to implement? Yeah, to prevent this from growing in the future. I don't know. Right now, I don't think there are any good proposals.
So your concern is that this is going to be a short-term fix potentially.
Yeah,
and it's still going to leave us with a long-term hole.
Well, it's putting us in a perfect position to fix the budget shortfall, kind of once and for all. Like if we were to just tighten the purse strings in some areas, and maybe even make some investments in others that will like pay dividends down the road. Like some infrastructure spending, today yields dividends in the future. But that I don't know that we're going to get it. I think that's probably wishful thinking.
Yeah, and I hope it's not wishful thinking. But with that said, man, is there anything else that you think we need to hit? I liked what he talked about with Bourbonism and how it's growing, but I've also really enjoyed the concept that we're not striving to be Scotch with bourbon. Yeah. That we're just striving to be that everyday whiskey. And I think that's an important thing to figure out and maybe we need to get someone in the bourbon industry on here to elaborate more on that. But I think his Singapore perspective was fascinating, that they're finally starting to get into it over there, and that it's just never going to probably be able to compete with Scotch just because the methods of creation are so different. Yeah.
And no, it was definitely an interesting perspective. I like hearing that, bourbon, it's not all hysteria, that the bourbon actually is becoming a drink of choice in Singapore and across Asia. I like hearing that. It's a great drink. It's my favorite thing to drink, but I think for a long time our state has been overly focused on that, when I think we could be building up other industries. Yeah. And I'm not in favor of, doing away with any of the current, tax policies we have that benefit the bourbon industry. And I think, we've already made some strides that I think were really positive, in the right direction. We opened up retail sale of bourbon in state, via online sales from distillers direct to consumer. That's a great thing. I don't know. I just think there are other things that we as a state can produce that, we need to maybe focus on.
Well, and I like that it's pushed more towards, it's become more focused on tourism locally. Yeah. Right. So that we can just sell that as part of our package as to having local events or if someone comes in town for a convention, it's an additional standard of living or additional reason to have a convention here, is because when you're not at the convention, you can go to a bourbon tasting, or you can go to Churchill Downs, So it is good from that they're finally joining, that they're doing the urban still houses and finally joining it's going to be convenient. I don't have to spend my off day driving all the way almost to Lexington or driving down to Bardstown to go be part of a bourbon tasting, right? And so I think that's the important aspect of it. But as far as a corporation side of it, I do think that it makes a lot of sense to still support them, but do we need to necessarily go all in? I think we have a lot of foundational economic areas that we need to focus on, and creating more middle tier jobs. So if that means focusing more on tech, or focusing more on using cooperatives or other business models to kind of lift people up, I think those are the areas that we need to necessarily focus on. And it is a little disheartening to kind of go all in on bourbon. And if this does in fact become a bubble, we're the only ones going to be hit by it. No one else is going to be affected by it. So you do have to throw a little caution to the wind with going all in on bourbon. But with that said, we need to capitalize on what we're on, the hot streak that bourbon's on.
Yeah. Well, I agree with all that. Again, I really, really enjoyed talking to Albie today. You got anything else you need to say before we wrap it up here?
No, I think it was great. And I'm excited that not only was he able to come on and give such an interesting interview, but that we're going to have a lot more strong guests just like him in the future.
Yeah. And it was great getting to talk to you today, Andrew.
Absolutely.
As always, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us on Building This Community. If you'd like any more information, you can follow us on Twitter at BuildingThisCom, COM, or you can follow Andrew
at Andrew J. Klump. And you can also follow Luke
at LMP43. Definitely subscribe, and we look forward to talking to you guys next week.